Uh, Rob, I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk with you, especially about your book. As you know, I'm a child and adolescent and an addiction psychiatrist. And so um, I'll say what I've told some of the medical students about your book, that if even a quarter of your book is accurate, we in the profession should be ashamed to be a part of it. It really hits home. Anyone, myself in training and over the years, sees it. We've had to be a part of it, even when we would try to stand up and make it different. And as a psychiatrist, is how do you manage being in a system like this when you see it and not fall into practicing it as much as possible? So my practice has always been sort of out of the norm, looking at the person, looking at the limitations of diagnosis and the whole problem. So I just wanted to tell you that this just is humbling and very important for the mental health profession to at least look at seriously.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, unfortunately, yeah, much more than a quarter of it's accurate. You know? But yeah, you know, and that is, you know, in all seriousness, right? The pain of it, I think, for all of us is, you know, at times I am wishing it wasn't, you know, and I wish some of this. One of the choices I made as a writer when I was working on the book was not to include things that as far as I could tell were really rare. You know, maybe it was extreme. It would have been sensational kind of story, but I thought that seems like unusual. This was a particularly abusive institution or person. And so I didn't include those stories. I included ones that I thought really did reflect things that one way or another I could verify were fairly common, you know, and that to me is one of the most disturbing elements of the book.
And that's what I appreciated about the book, that you did have some extremes, but you didn't stick with the extremes. And that makes me ask you a question, because you have a very broad perspective of the field, from personal experience, family experience, and all the research that you've done and the different people you've talked to. One of the things I have to struggle with, that I hear, especially when extremes are talked about, how much do you, if you could take it in some detail, how much do you feel that the field of mental health fundamentally is bad or wrong in its foundation versus it's just bad care?
Bad in its
bad care,
I
meaning
see, yeah,
how,
interesting question.
meaning not what it is, but how it's taught, how it's applied, and how it's maybe misapplied.
Very interesting question. I love that question. I think that's really worth exploring, because, you know, a lot of people have said to me that I interviewed patients, gosh, if they had just been nicer, if they had just been a little bit more honest about these medications, what they could do and not do, you know, if they had just told me that the diagnoses were flexible and loose and the science wasn't clear, but maybe I would find this helpful to think of it in these terms, it would have been fine. Like a lot of people said, like if they had just been nicer in the experience. And I think that's worthy of note, right? Because between niceness, respectfulness, collaboration, you go a really long way. And then if you go further, and agency, right? And you give me that. So it's like, Rob, I'm just here to work with you. I'm here to be your ally. You know, based on my experience, what can I offer you? What can I give you? And I'm allowed to pick and choose what I'm finding helpful. And you get that back. You're like, okay, Rob finds that useful. And you can work with that, right? I think that would be transformative in and of itself, right? We wouldn't have to change anything.
I mean,
else.
just how it's practiced.
How it's practiced.
By the psychiatrist, by the therapist, by anyone in the system.
Absolutely. And that's why I think that question you've raised is so important, because a lot of people say that to me, and I see it too. And somehow the opposite has happened. And that is that it's becoming meaner, crueler, more cynical. I see bitterness in practitioners a lot. I don't see niceness, and that's what patients are running into as well. So I think that's huge. So for me, and that is one of the things I sort of campaign around for the book, is just honesty, more honesty and transparency across the system, because that will be a step in the right direction. I mean, I do, as you know, talk about many things in the book where there are questions around the science of the diagnoses, how effective these treatments are, and I think all of that is important. But gosh, if we just had true informed consent going on in the system, that would be a huge leap forward in and of itself.
Yeah. I spent some time last night going through parts of your book, and I was struck by things very different than when I had read it months ago. Somewhere you referred to, and I think this was your words, that you said this chapter is about the dark heart of the mental health system. And you used the word heart. We have lost our heart. We have lost our compassion in many ways, as you say. We're maybe meaner. We're not as nice. Maybe we can go into it sometime. But psychiatry and mental health, we've lost what it all started with. We've lost our soul.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? And you can tell me what the trajectory of your career was. But for example, Kernan Mannion, who's in my book, is a psychiatrist, and and he talks about how inspiring he found reading incredible books by psychiatrists that he was reading back in the 60s and early 70s, and that's what made him want to become a psychiatrist, was that it was going to be about exploring, about maximizing human potential, all that we can be together, and all these kinds of things. And then within his own lifetime, within his career, he saw this much more dramatic turn towards medicalization and billing related to medicalization. He no longer could take the time with patients, and he found it actually kind of distressing and upsetting, and he became really burned out. And then he discovered that lots of his colleagues were feeling this way too, and he kind of lived that transition into a much more medicalized approach to this. And many doctors who have been around a long time in our society today have been kind of telling me that story, that they witnessed the transition from a more kind of therapeutic environment and one of more collaboration between psychiatrists and patients than this more sort of aggressive and pathologizing, medicalizing approach that we take today. And is that something you've witnessed as well?
I was just going to say, let me share a little. I've been in the field long enough that when I entered medical school, I knew I wanted to be a psychiatrist. And they trained us as medical students to be psychiatrists. And the faculty were our friends, and we would go to their houses, and we would hear the compassion that they brought. And this was in the early 1970s, and medications were still not the priority. So I started my medical career in psychiatry, where it was not all about medications. And so I've sort of resisted that. And during my residency training in psychiatry, the DSM-3 came out. Overnight, the whole field changed. And it immediately became less psychological and more medicalized. And when that was added to the medications and new medications and all the money that goes into promoting that, psychiatrists no longer were with people. We were managing medications. We were managing the codes, the diagnoses, and whatever. And I think that's when we lost our heart and our soul. And we were no longer nice, because that wasn't the priority anymore.
Right.
The priority was lost.
Right, and that's what it seems that we don't have great data, and of course the data between the 1950s and today, is not the same at all. But from roughly that period, and I link it to the introduction of Prozac, really, at the late 80s and 90s, and the concept of the biochemical imbalance spreading across the culture. And with that, what we see in the data that we can get is that's when involuntary commitment definitely started increasing. So it seems that there's a direct linkage between this notion that, oh, we're curing some sort of disease with these drugs, and that notion and the idea that we can more readily justify using force to implement that. And to me, that's that problem has continued to this day. It seems that it's never been more medicalized, and the system has never been more aggressive.
And you mentioned Prozac, because as a psychiatrist, it's sort of been a struggle in my career regarding how much medication, how much is therapy. I pride my clinical work as I'm very good at determining what's biology and what's psychology. I'll tell you, my first job out of my training was to set up an inpatient adolescent addiction program. And we could lock the doors at that time for 3 months, and we had them contained. But I was told you cannot use any medications. It's going to be a 12-step program. And I said, okay, that's not how I'm trained. And we built it, we started it, and within 3 months, the patients ruled the ward. Mm-hmm. The 3 bipolar patients in manic episodes rallied everyone else, and we almost had a war. And all of the clinicians, all of the workers came up in a recovery, and they were against medications. So I said, sorry, we're using medications. Treated those 3 patients bipolar, put them on lithium, and in 2 weeks, they changed the whole thing. And people said, oh, maybe there is something about this medication piece. So I've had some of the extreme successes with medication, and then I've had some where I've tried 4 medications and nothing's working. Well, maybe I'm missing something. Like you mentioned, trauma. Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit about how you see trauma and the unrecognized and carefully unwell treatment of trauma might be part of what's confusing the whole system? Makes us become very biological and very afraid.
Yeah, well, we certainly know there's lots of studies showing that a very high percentage of people coming into the mental health system, and particularly psychiatric hospitals, have some sort of severe trauma in their background, often linked to things that can be verified. So we know that's there. And then what I found through my research is that often they're being re-traumatized by these very aggressive interventions. Yes. Yeah. So the interventions tend to mimic some of the most common ways that these people were abused if they had childhood abuse. So the use of security guards, restraints, force stripping, all these common elements of aggressive force treatment often leave people much more traumatized. And in fact, one of the most distressing things that I hear, and I hear it consistently, is even from people who've personally experienced sexual assault, childhood physical assault, will say, my experience in the psychiatric hospital was worse.
I could believe it.
Yeah, and that's very
heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think, to me, like, that's shocking to me. I'm a journalist, I report that in my book, but I would think that the entire profession would be up in arms about itself and about forced treatment in this context, saying, how can we possibly work in an environment where this has become routine? And it's something that, like I say, I can just put that out on Twitter tomorrow, and there will be 100 patients who respond, and I don't even have that many followers, but who'll say, that happened to me. I know this because I did it a few weeks ago. I just mentioned it, and it was like, that's how I feel, that's how I feel, that's how I feel. And so it's easy to find this, and how can anyone practice in that? That's what I don't understand.
How can we continue when we all see it?
Why is it me bringing this up, right? Why are psychiatrists like, oh my God, we can't practice in this kind of environment. How can we do a good job?
So let me take it into maybe a darker area, because the whole country is struggling with systemic racism. Do you get any sense that this is oppression? And this is an oppression of the underclass, underprivileged, undermoneyed, underage, and overaged. Do you think that this in some way is just part of that, not necessarily racism, but extreme prejudice against people that actually, you know what? As soon as we put a diagnosis and make the diagnosis priority, it creates me and an other, and you as the other immediately become dehumanized. Do you get a sense that that's...
Yeah, that's one of the arguments I'm really trying to implicitly make with the book, and to some degree explicitly as well, but that I see the use of involuntary commitment powers, mental health law powers more generally, and that these are being used within the framework of a system that already has many aspects to it that are very prejudicial and oppressive for large swaths of the population. And this is becoming actually one of the dominant ways in which those oppressive impulses are able to be manifested, because these powers are so broad and so flexible. So that's one of the kind of sirens I'm trying to raise with the book, is that people need to be really mindful of this, that many institutions of power can utilize and are utilizing mental health laws more and more. And again, right, I come back to, it would seem to me that psychiatrists, medical professionals, people who work in the field should be the ones up in arms about this, right? Raising the alarm, because, it's obvious to anyone that looks like, hey, these drugs are being much more broadly used, in nursing homes, much more broadly used in schools, much more broadly used across the population. But instead, when I'm interviewing many people that work in the profession, they're often still justifying it. They're going, no, those people, they really are severely mentally ill. They really do need these treatments. And I'm like, but the need seemingly has been increasing quite dramatically. Per capita rates of psychiatric detention have been increasing a lot for decades now. Like, it doesn't look like we're using them as a last resort. How are we using them? We need to really look at that again.
And I think that's part of what really hurt in reading your book, that you make it clear that we are part of a system that's gotten out of control and that uses itself as oppressive, as controlling, as violent. But you make me ask the question myself, why are there not psychiatrists up in arms? I'll share with you. So I think about it. When I started in my career, I could spend time and talk with a patient. I had the time. I didn't have all the demands. I didn't have 20-minute med checks and 30-minute evaluations. And the overwhelm that we have as psychiatrists has almost made us passive to everything else that's going on. Psychiatrists ourselves, we used to be in charge of programs. We're not anymore. There are administrators that tell us what to do and indirectly tell us how to practice psychiatry and how to practice medicine. And I think that's part of what has allowed the psychiatrists to sort of turn a deaf ear to some of these things. And if we speak up in the system, it isn't always looked at usefully, let's say.
Wow, that's powerful. Yeah, and you're reminding me that that's what Jonathan Gadsby, the nurse, psychiatric nurse in my book, said to me too. That he feels oppressed. He felt oppressed working in the environment. He's now a teacher, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And
we feel oppressed.
Yeah, and he said, I don't want to compare it. He doesn't want to say, oh, I as a nurse was as oppressed as the patient who is being involuntarily committed. He said, I don't want to say that, but I do think that it's correct to say that the liberation of nurses, is closely linked to the liberation of the psychiatric patient. It sounds like you're saying the same thing that
you
psychiatrists
really,
need to be liberated.
And you mentioned something. There's just such burnout in medicine and even in psychiatry that that might be part of it. That if we work in systems where we unconsciously or inadvertently feel oppressed over the years, it's like, why do I want to keep doing this? And that's interesting. That will bring me to another area. That's why probably about 30 years ago, I realized that spirituality was a saving grace. That if I could look at the nature of what's really important in people, if you use the word spirit, if you use the word soul, and connect with that, the older I've gotten, the more enjoyable my practice is. And I think I'm probably pretty rare because I've been in the field over 40 years, and it's more enjoyable now than it was 30 years ago. And I think that's because of the spiritual part. That when I can connect with that spiritual part and in any way help it to just wake up, to be there at the moment when that wakens, it's just so heartening. I'll keep working.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean...
So what do you mentioned that you met a lot of people that had spiritual experiences that were mishandled by the field, and that's part of what we want to do with the documentary. But the other part we want to emphasize with the documentary is spirituality and spiritual awakening and spiritual experiences should be promoted. That open, and some of the other people, I mean, Tammy, right? Was talking about connecting with that and bringing that liveness out. So can you say something more than just misunderstood spiritual experiences, which absolutely is a real problem in psychiatry, but the usefulness that you could see real spirituality may play in transforming the system? Or
yeah, it's tremendous. Like, I often start with myself with that example, because some of the people that I talk with whose lives went off the rails, and we'll trace it back to, like, when did that really start for you? And often they describe something which I understand as, and would have understood at the time, as a kind of spiritual moment in their lives of sudden insight, looking into the mirror and suddenly seeing many faces, and I'm thinking, oh, you're having a sense of oneness with different types of people that were inside you, and you were feeling that. But for them it was terrifying, and then they didn't get that reinforcement. Somebody saying, hey, this could be a really beautiful moment that you've just experienced, and let's explore it together, and what's going on for you in life that might have brought it about. Instead, they were pathologized, and they got afraid of it themselves. Oh my God, I have to repress it, and their whole lives went down a different route. And so that's what I see a lot, is the people who like me, readily had that available and had support for it in our lives to go, this is part of, I saw it in spiritual terms, artistic terms as well. Yeah, I'm going to write about this. And that's going to be inspiring to people to read poetry about my transformative experience, right? That itself is a form of my engagement in the world, which I also see, I see art as a kind of spiritual expression. And so, yeah, and I've seen that in others as well. So when they find that pathway for them, right, and it can be spiritual, and I just even want to broaden that term out, because for some people they link that directly to religion, right. But I think we're meaning it in a broader sense, where it is just that potential for what does it really mean to be me, and how can I be different in my life and in my understanding of myself. And when I think whoever it is in their lives, right? It could be a psychiatrist, it could be a friend, it could be a child, it could be an animal that they interrelate with in some way, right? It can be just things that happen in their lives that open that up for them to go, oh, this isn't this isn't necessarily a bad thing that's happening to me. Maybe it's stressful. Maybe it's not well accommodating in the situation I'm in right now in my life, but there are opportunities there, and with support and with nurturing and with orientation, they can often find that as a pathway through those kind of powerful energies. That's what I call them, like a non-ordinary state, or it's like powerful energies emerging, and you can find ways to...
That's it. The non-ordinary state has a power of its own that we're suppressing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's an opportunity for sure. And certainly, like, we know that if that comes up at a difficult time when there isn't support around it.
Like in an emergency room.
Yeah, exactly. In an emergency room, or in the workplace where nobody's accepting of anything like that, or, you know, you're in a school that has no tolerance for any kind of, you know, whatever, or people just start interpreting you a strange way. Like, I think the mere fact that I identified myself as an artist early on in my life, it was a huge part of that, right? Because if I'd thought of myself as an engineer, I would have thought, what am I going to do with these energies? They're not helping my engineering right now at all. That's how I would have thought. They might have in the end, you know, like I think they could. But because I knew right away, like, oh yeah, I'm going to write like a character like this or whatever, it just always gave me a sense that of groundedness, you know, that allowed me then to kind of go into those danger zones that I think, had I been repressing that energy more, wouldn't have felt available. And I think that's the fear. I do believe, I want to say, you know, for any engineers out there, right, that I do believe you can have non-ordinary experiences and still be a great engineer. but you know, you need to be able to process feelings, right, and get through it. And I think that's sorely missing. And I think, you know, we go to other cultures, right? I think I've cited Stanislav Grof already. He's pointed that out, that almost every other culture except modern Western society, Europe and North America specifically, you know, almost every other culture historically and today still has spirituality and non-ordinary experiences kind of at the heart. Very
of the
revered,
culture.
Yeah, a very revered and important part. Rites of passage, you know, there's ways in which these are understood and nurtured, and oh, this is a transformative time of your life. How can we be there for you? You know, when the guru in India started going through a wacky time, everybody rallied around, ooh, the guru's transforming, you know, we have to like provide food and safety. And then an indigenous person that I interviewed told me that exact story. Oh, the big house, right? When people got into these extreme mental states, everybody rallied around to support and help. And it was like, wow, revered and nurtured. And instead in ours, you're kind of pulled out of your community, you're locked away, you're treated as if something really bad and dangerous is going on. And how can that but amplify your fears and paranoia?
Just the way you said that is a terrible image. It's as if we're squelching the soul of their creativity in doing what we're doing in the system.
Yeah, I don't want to say that because I don't think I don't know that it's as systemic as that, you know, and organized, but I do think
I don't think
happening.
It's intentional.
Right. It's not intentional.
No, I would agree. I don't think it's intentional at all.
But it's happening. It's definitely happening to a lot of people, and I think, yeah, like some of the people that I see, like, I mean, I say that all the time. It's weird, like out in the mainstream media, we see often people who are being treated against who are portrayed as if they almost like they have severe dementia, Alzheimer's. They don't know that they're ill, and people get this image that, oh, you know, yeah, like a person with severe dementia literally doesn't know who they are or where they are, and we know that is rarely, if ever, the case with just a pure psychiatric condition, right? Like schizophrenia or anxiety, depression, or any of these things. So. Yeah, like, you know, I find that in fact a lot of people who've been involuntarily committed seem to me to be above average in their intelligence, their creativity, their critique of the world and things like that.
But they don't know the system, and they surrender to the system. The doctor knows best, or the family members have
some
them
do,
surrender.
and some fight it and get locked into
well,
a battle.
that's even worse.
Yeah.
I know we're looking at time, but I want to add just a few statements and then some questions. I have to bring out, there in your book you mentioned a person, Irit Shimrat?
Mm-hmm. Irit Shimrat.
Irit Shimrat? Yeah. Was that a man or a woman?
It's a woman, yeah.
A woman. She had a sentence in your book that I think just captured the whole thing, that she said that the system as she was hospitalized right, was crushing her creative soul. And the way she described her experience and what she was like before, what she was like after. Fortunately, she pulled out and learned to use it as a real creative part and transformation in her life. But that quote, that it was crushing her creative soul, I thought was important.
And I want to comment on, I mean, Ritz had become a dear friend to me. She was one of the first people I ever talked with about her involuntary commitment experiences. So I've known her for decades now. And, you know, she helped edit the book too, because she's a professional editor. And so I got feedback from her on every chapter, and that was really great. And, you know, it brings tears to my eyes, actually, that, because I know that struggle is still real for her, that she feels that her first commitment was when at age 20, and she was applying to school to be a creative writing program, and then her whole life kind of got derailed, and she does still feel that way, that it was a real crushing of who
it hit her
she.
At such a sensitive age when she was trying to step out.
Yeah, and she's always now, forever after, a sense of risk if she goes into her fantasy world in some way, and too deeply, too strongly, and also just the sense of anger and frustration that it left her with towards the system, right? That's also hard to grapple with, right? It's like you feel you've been brutalized by someone else, and it's hard for people to kind of get through that in the course of their lives, right? To really move on from it. And I think that to some degree, because she continues to witness the aggressiveness of the system, it's been hard for her to actually ever not feel angry about that.
And I think that really puts a point there. I was saying, psychiatry may originally have been to look at the soul. I mean, the mistranslation of Sigmund Freud was, he was after the I, the soul, and when it came to American, was translated into English, it became mechanized. A book by Bruno Bedelheim, really, Freud and Man's Soul, really talks about that. But in my work with spirituality, for years, I rebelled against religion and whatever. So for me to be saying things I'm saying now in spirituality has really been just sort of a 180 degrees turn. We have an experience that really does fit the word soul. It's a moral core that is loving and compassionate, that steps into the world with a powerful faith and courage. When that is injured, it's as injured as a cut.
Yeah.
And the field doesn't realize that. So you just described with Imre that at a critical point in her life, her soul, as it's developing at 20, in terms of a creative person, was just damaged. Mm-hmm. And it's a real damage. We don't believe that that's really real, but I think I think we have a spiritual core within us, and that it functions to manage and drive us as human beings to the good parts of life, to our self-worth and dignity. And that gets injured. But we have yet to put that into neuroscience and to put that into biology, but I think someday we may be able to do that, because the experience of that damage to the soul is as real as a broken leg.
Yeah, yeah. And like you said, it's so important to raise that question of, is it possible to nurture it back, possible to heal it and stuff? Because I think that I look at my, English teachers in high school, right? Like, I wanted to be a writer, and I was submitting all sorts of crazy, like, I'm a professional writer today. I think I was a pretty good writer at the time, and that's it. I would go from getting the top grades to almost failing at times because I was just experimenting all over the map. And I think now I really respect all of the entire English department of my high school because they just treated me as that. Like, here's a creative guy doing creative stuff. They didn't, they never called in the counselor. They didn't call in the psychiatrist on me, right? Even though I'm sure that there was lots of things in there where they were kind of going,
on the edge.
yeah, where they go, ooh, there's some violence here, there's this or that, right? Like, what's this guy really doing? And they would, they knew well because they did, I would come in and, why did you give me this mark? And we'd talk, but they were great. They were like, they would really share and talk with me. And so that prevented what you're talking about. That prevented that damage to my creative spirit, right? Because I think if in that moment they had called in and somebody had said, you got an illness, son, and you got a problem, that alone, without anything else happening, just that alone would have locked me in to a fight, and maybe I would have been strong enough, right? Because I was already pretty strong to fend it off, right, and survive.
Or you might have been beaten.
Or I might have been beaten, exactly. And forever had that question in my head. And when things went bad for me as an artist, I might have thought, oh, maybe I am just like ill or crazy and I can't do this, or all those things. And so, yeah, like I think it's really important, as you're suggesting, to prevent that moment from ever occurring. But I like to believe, and I think it is possible, many people I've seen are finding healing pathways, right, with that kind of support, to identify it, just as you're saying, as a spiritual thing.
As
a
something
soul.
real, something important, and can
Right.
be an incredible
That's-
opportunity for growth.